This tree, this poem is about life, abundance and green, where forests are fuel, breathing for the world. A tree is like a woman, the bark of skin blemished by birth, or it could be a boy, branches swaying free, a martyr of hours coming home on the wings of a storm. Sometimes I see a tree and I see a daughter seeking the fatherhood of oaks. This tree, this poem stands alone in a blanket of green and takes in its lust of air, filling the gap from oceans to this clay in the rain called man. We dance around trees, dance for the fall of leaves, dance until windswept and scattered, we descend like fine dew or tears tracing lines on a trunk-stitched face. We need trees like we need the rail ties they carry us, the fences between us, the paper poems are scribbled on. We need trees to sing a silent sonata of bloom. This tree, this poem, is smothering in the city's crush. It rises through cement cracks like the earth invading, reminding, protesting, and demanding the sky. But the skull of dark days is also carved on the bark, branches screaming with the strange fruit of swaying bodies. A tree is a friend, a child's playground, or a gallows. We make of trees what we make of ourselves.
Thank you. That was Luis J. Rodriguez, 2014 Official Poet Laureate of Los Angeles and founding editor of Tia Chucha Press, now in its 30th year. Rodriguez is the author of 16 books, including the best-selling memoir Always Running, La Vida Loca, Gang Days in LA. His most recent poetry collection is Borrowed Bones. His first book of essays, released in 2020, From Our Land to Our Land, Essays, Journeys, and Imaginings from a Native Chicanx Writer. Thank you so much, Luis J. Rodriguez, for kicking out this episode of the Red Hen Press Poetry Hour, brought to you by the Broad Stage at Home. I'm your host, Sandra Tsing Loh, and today's topic and theme is the poetics of climate change. And to introduce the show up top, I'd like to welcome co-founder and managing editor of Red Hen Press, Kate Gale. Hello, Kate. It's great to see you. And sitting here today for artistic and executive director of the Broad Stage, Rob Bayless, who is on vacation. I hope he's getting out of his house and driving somewhere COVID safely away. Please welcome the Broad Stage's director of artistic planning, Eric Bloom. Welcome. Hi. Okay, you guys.
Great to be here.
A pleasure. The poetics of climate change. Tell us how this evening came about.
Well, Eric, tell us a little bit about Alanna Mitchell, because she was sort of the nexus of this whole idea. And then we sort of started to build around Alanna Mitchell.
Yeah.
Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Alanna is an extraordinary writer, New York Times journalist, and she had gone on a series of ocean expeditions with being the only non-scientist, basically studying the ocean. The carbonization of the ocean, and in her writing about it, she really she wanted to find a way to really communicate the story in the most impactful way, and she turned it into a one-woman play, which was at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival last year when Fringe festivals were still happening, and Rob saw it there. Was absolutely both horrified at the content, but also blown away by the artistry. And so we were immediately encouraged to bring it to the Broad Stage, where we will be presenting it if all goes as planned, in the spring, in April, as part of a solo theater festival that we have. And so she really conveys this story of climate change in a way that makes you feel. Which usually inspires some kind of action, which is more actionable to me personally, rather than going through the head. It goes through the heart. And so having her as a sort of anchor for this piece really allowed, I think, Kate and her team to curate.
And your sound has gone out for me a moment. It's back now. Right. And I think, Kate, yes, you were going to talk about the interplay of poets. How did you choose these fantastic poets that are here today?
Well, I mean, like the line of poetry that I always think of when I think of sort of the ideal in poetry is Rilke's line in the Torso of Apollo that poem ends, "You must change your life." And I really think that in an ideal world, that's what poetry does. It makes us want to change our life in some way. And I really think that the science poets do that more than almost anyone else. Kamiko Han is a science poet. Kate Coles, who we've had on earlier in the show, has also gone to Antarctica and looked at what's going on in Antarctica. And then, of course, Elizabeth Bradfield has as well. And so to me, the poetics of climate change are all these poets who have looked at Earth and science and climate change in different ways and asked us to change our lives. And part of that to me is that when someone suggests that you should change your life, the question is, how can you hear that? And as Eric mentioned, sometimes you can hear that more easily through a play or through a poem than you can when you're just reading the New York Times. Because something wakens in you when you hear something creatively, because you feel it in a particular way. And so for me, when I'm reading poetry about environmental issues, I feel excited because it's my language. And so I really fell in love with this book Elizabeth Bradfield had written about going to Antarctica. And all of these poets have written about the environment in ways that are absolutely astonishing. And I think that our audience will be very excited to hear all these poets that are going to be reading in conversation here tonight.
Thank you. And we do give shout outs to our wonderful viewers. Carlton Johnston, Elon Egelan Mazzini is such a fan of Tia Chucha. Alan Chapman of KUSE, hello. Chris Carmen is joining from Iowa City, which we have such a national and international audience. And Don Robinson says it's a great topic. So thanks to Kate Gale and Eric Bloom for setting us up top. We're really excited about the show. So thank you. And enjoy. And with that, we're going to pull up our first poet, if we can. Our first esteemed guest, Elizabeth Bradfield. Now, and here's the duality here, poet/naturalist. Elizabeth Bradfield is the author of Once Removed, Approaching Ice, Interpretive Work, and Toward Antarctica, which offers a unique view of the last continent through photographs and prose. Theorem, a collaboration with artist Antonia Contro, is forthcoming this fall. Yes, we will have a fall in 2020. Elizabeth's work have been published in The New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, and the Kenyon Review. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of Broadsided Press. She works as a naturalist and guide and teaches creative writing at Brandeis University. So welcome, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to this conversation tonight, to be in the company of writers who I admire so much and who have inspired me is really thrilling and humbling. And I'm excited to see this conversation about, how do we grapple with climate change? How do we grapple with our place in the world as humans in the big world around us? And it's true that I split my life between work as a naturalist, helping out with some field biology work, and also I kind of see it as I'm a secret agent among the biologists, my secret poet self, and a secret agent among the poets as my, sciencey self. And I enjoy that dynamic quite a bit. And I think what's really interesting is that while climate change and climate justice is something that occupies a huge portion of my brain, I won't put a percentage on it. It explicitly doesn't enter my work that often as a direct address. And I think that my work as a naturalist and my work as a poet is really grounded in close observation to really try and see clearly non-human beings and also our human selves interacting with the non-human world and dramatizing what that looks like, and trying to bring to the surface a clarity about how we engage, how we perceive, how our social selves, our gender, our race, our sexuality influence how we interpret what we see outside of the human realm. So I'm going to read a few poems that I think are on the closer edge of engaging with the idea of climate change. And I think, fires in the world right now, the effects of the hurricane hitting Louisiana and Texas right now, where I live on Cape Cod, on a smaller scale, sea level rise, and just shifts in weather patterns that we're seeing. We're all experiencing localized changes from historic norms. And I'm going to start with a poem that comes from my naturalist self. It's a poem titled, it's got a long, weird title, Historic Numbers of Right Whales Skim Feeding Off Cape Cod. And for those of you who don't know what a right whale is, a right whale, a North Atlantic right whale, is one of the most endangered large cetaceans on the planet. Most of my naturalist life engages in the marine realm. And right whales, every year, they breed and calve off Florida, Georgia. They come on up following the spring plankton bloom, and they hang out in Cape Cod Bay for a while, and then they carry on further north. And their movements have been radically shifting in the last few years. We can't say scientifically that it's due to climate change, but it's probably based on prey availability, which is probably based on shifts in ocean temperatures. And these huge animals, these, 55-foot long animals, 65 tons, they feed on little organisms that are the size of a grain of rice. And for those of you, little plankton called copepods, for those of you who have watched SpongeBob SquarePants, you have seen a copepod. It's a little type of plankton. It has a long body. It has a red eyeball in the middle of its forehead, 2 antennae off the top. And they are amazing foundations of the northern food chain, as krill is to the Antarctic, copepods are to the Arctic. And I think that's all you need to know, except for that right whales are endangered because we hunted them. Before we discovered oil, they were our oil, and they were the right whales to hunt, which is how they got their common name. And it's very true that copepods have the smell that I will describe in this poem. So, historic numbers of right whales skim feeding off Cape Cod. Who would expect their appetite would come to seem ominous? But now I know they are voids of hunger. They plow a field of plankton, turn, plow again. They strip the water like loggers on a clear cut. The bay this spring seemed overrun by stern, enormous beetles, black, vaguely military, inexorable. Poor plankton, adrift in flailing clouds, poor blushing copepods with delicate antennae, watermelon scent. You don't stand a chance. Week after week, right whales eat the bay down until they have to leave it. Time and proximity have made them monsters. This must be how it was before. And in that before, I mean the before of our hunting them, before of their depletion from these oceans. Our concern about right whales now is so vast, but how do we understand what the oceans were pre-hunting, pre-exploitation? Those kind of questions really occupy me as a poet. How do we inhabit a mind that can understand and feel about the situation of right whales in our ocean and the changing circumstances around them? I want to read another whale poem, kind of keeping my eye on time. And then I want to read a little bit from this book about working in Antarctica as a naturalist. But this poem, it's got another long title. It's another whale poem. It's titled, When One Known to You Dies, the Rearranging of Space and Time Begins. And it's a poem for a fin whale, which is the second largest animal on the planet. Only the blue whales are bigger. And as a naturalist here on Cape Cod, for the past 20 years, I've been working and helping observe these animals, and they're friends, you know, and a fin whale, Ladders, in 2019 died and washed ashore. And I was there for the necropsy of the animal, and then later for its kind of falling apart and moving around and washing ashore in other places. And it's a really emotional thing to connect to these non-human ocean species that I feel very grateful to have the opportunity to do. You know, the ocean, it's a big, reflecting, vast space, and understanding intimately what's going on out there, I think, is so critical to all of us on the planet. I'm going to end with this poem because the ocean controls our weather. It controls our climate. It controls the air we breathe. About 50% of the oxygen we breathe is produced by phytoplankton respiring in the ocean. And yet it feels removed from so many of our lives. So these intimate moments that allow us to connect with beings in the ocean are really amazing. So here's this last poem, and I'll end with this. When one known to you dies, the rearranging of space and time begins. For Ladders, 2019, Balanoptera physalis. A rib, I know whose, in the harbor under waves. How heavy would it be, hefted? Low tide will bear it, will allow pickers to take it, make it decor. Whalebone with tulips, leaching minerals, oil, the perennials stronger for it. Up the beach, the rest of him, unscattered and held still by sinew, flesh, spine and ribs, but no longer the jaw, which when he first washed up ashore and was flayed by flensers and sun, proved to be broken. We knew him, this fin whale, Ladders. I can't remember the year, the moment of my first sighting or resighting of his stuttered prop scar, long healed, an easy marker. Who was I then? Young and newly arrived, sorrows vast, and losses, it must be said, negligible, negligible. What does his rib curve now? That space filled by water, that emptiness and knowledge of what it once held.
Thank you. Wonderful work by Elizabeth Bradfield, who will be rejoining the conversation in about 15, 20 minutes. So Elizabeth will be back. If you're just joining us now, this is the Red Hen Press Poetry Hour, brought to you by the Broad Stage at Home. I'm your host, Sandra Tsing Loh, and it's fun to see some old friends here of the Poetry Hour. Hello to Red Snowstone, also from Iowa City. We're strongly represented there. Donald Petrie, Shelley Ann Couch, Adam Farkas, Harlan Rotblatt. Hello, hello, and welcome to all. So next, I'm going to bring up our next poet, the wonderful Natalie Diaz. Natalie Diaz is a Mojave and enrolled member of the Gila River Indian Tribe and a MacArthur Genius Award winner, 2018. Her first poetry collection was When My Brother Was an Aztec, published by Copper Canyon Press. Most recently, Post-Colonial Love Poem was published by Grey Wolf in 2020. She's received fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, Lannan Literary Foundation, the Native Arts Council Foundation, and Princeton University, to name a few. Diaz is the director of the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands and the Maxine and Jonathan Marshall Chair in Modern and Contemporary Poetry at Arizona State University. She lives in Phoenix. Welcome, Natalie.
Hi, gracias for having me.
Oh, it's so wonderful to have you here. And if I could just, before you read, you were born and raised in the Fort Mojave Indian Village in Needles, California, on the banks of the Colorado River. Probably there were very few fin or right whales there. What was that like growing up there? And what was it like growing up? And how did that influence your writing?
I mean, people don't think of the desert as a place of abundance, but it really is. And the river is a large part of that abundance and generosity. Something I'm going to kind of wedge a PSA in here, especially because a lot of our conversations to do with climate are framed in science, as if indigenous knowledges are not those things until science recognizes them. And we can count this as part of my reading time. But there are about 370 million indigenous peoples around the world, which is less than 5% of our world population. However, considering the small number we represent, indigenous peoples manage or hold tenure over 25% of the world's land surface. So a quarter of the world's land surface, which doesn't account for our relationship with waters. And considering, again, that small number, the amount of land surface that we have tenure over, that we manage, we support 80 to 85% of global diversity. And when you consider that, it's kind of an amazing equation to consider. And of that 80% of biodiversity, of that 25% of land surface, that is just what capitalism and our nations haven't been able to destroy because they've been in our care. And so that is a relationship that I have here in my desert as well, and with my water. The Colorado River is the most endangered river in the US. So.
And at the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands, that's got to be one of the most beautifully named institutions. Can you talk a little bit about that phrase and how that resonates?
Yeah, I mean, and Borderlands it's a touchy phrase, right? It's and the way I think about it is I think of bordered lands, and I also think of the many borders we have of human relationality, much less the ways humans relate with non-human life. But it's a place where we are using an indigenous perspective, so thinking out of American time, or out of, meaning South and North America. So thinking out of time and imagining that we don't have to acknowledge the nation is going to love us, recognize us, treat us as, quote, citizens, but that we have a way of being and a way of thinking that is both outside of that and also beyond that. So the center is a conduit for those kinds of thinking. So it is interested in constellating conversations. I've thought often about bringing Elizabeth out, to put her in some conversations with her ocean and our ancient ocean, and some of our friends in Hawaii and, on the other side of things. So it's a place where we're trying to talk about relationality from an indigenous perspective, and indigenous meaning not just place, but relationship with land. So it's not necessarily that you are there or how you got there, but it's about what you do and how you practice that relationship once you are there. So, yeah, so those are some of the ways that we kind of look out and try to make connections.
And do you want to say anything about what you'll be reading?
No, not necessarily. I think, I mean, my relationship with the land is one, again, that's very intimate in terms of the ways I've been taught to be in relationship to land and water where I live, and from my different cultures. And it's also very much framed by my relationship with my country. So I feel like people are often like, oh, is this political, or is this, quote, environmental? And I think it's neither, but I think it's really trying to create a space for a different kind of relationship. So the two poems I'll read will touch on that. So yeah, and gracias for having me. I'm going to start just with the title poem of the book, which is Post-Colonial Love Poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snakebite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started before those millennia ago, and onward those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever-blooming wounds. I was built by wage, so I wage love and worse. Always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flash of your pale skin, settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pool of all my thirsts. I learned drink in a country of drought. We pleasure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon polished by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel turning green, mottled red, the jaspers of our desires. There are wild flowers in my desert which take up to 20 years to bloom. The seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, lifting them in its copper current, opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life. Where your hands have been are diamonds down my shoulders, my back, thighs. I am your culebra. I am in the dirt for you. Your hips are quartz light and dangerous, two rose-horned rams ascending a soft desert wash before the November sky untethers 100-year flood. The desert returns suddenly to its ancient sea. Arise the wild heliotrope, scorpion weed, blue phacelia, which hold purple the way a throat can hold the shape of any great hand. Great hands is what she called mine. The rain will eventually come or not. Until then, we touch our bodies like wounds. The war never ended and somehow begins again. There's an epigraph from a Mahmoud Darwish poem that follows this poem to open the book. We admitted that we were human beings and melted for love in this desert. And I'll finish with this last poem, but one of the ways that I have imagined my relationship with the land and with the idea of the way I believe that my human life is a very small part of what life is, of what the energy of you know, life, momentum, all story, all of these things are. And so one of the ways that I have come to addressing poetry and poetry that's in relationship with my land is through the idea or the question of desire. I feel like I have imagined myself as humans in general as a pleasure of the earth or a desire of the earth, and we were created from it. So I will just finish with this poem. So you all in LA, I don't know if you'll be able to see the Milky Way the way we can see it out here because it's so dark where we are. But our word for Milky Way, you'll hear it, is Achiahan Nunye. And so there's a story that goes with it that I will mention. How the Milky Way was made. My river was once unseparated, was Colorado, red, fast flood, able to take anything it could wet in a wild rush all the way to Mexico. Now it is shattered by 15 dams over 1,450 miles, pipes and pumps filling swimming pools and sprinklers in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. To save our fish, we lifted them from our skeletoned riverbeds, loosed them in our heavens, set them aster, Achiahan, Mojave salmon, Colorado pike minnow. Up there they glide gilled with stars. You see them now, God large gold-green sides, lunar white belly to breast, making their great speeded way across the darkest hours, rippling the sapphire sky water into a galaxy road. The blurred wake they drag as they make their path through the night sky is called Achiahan Nunye. our words for Milky Way. Coyote, too, is up there, locked in the moon, after his failed attempt to leap it, fishing net wet and empty slung over his back. A prisoner, blue and dreaming, of unzipping the salmon-silked skins with his teeth. Oh, the weakness of any mouth as it gives itself away to the universe of a sweet milk body. As my own mouth is dreamed to thirst, the long desire ways the 100,000 light-year roads of your wrists and thighs. Gracias.
Thank you so much. So wonderful work by Natalie Diaz, who will be joining us in about 10 minutes for a conversation with Elizabeth Bradfield and our next guest. If you're just joining us, this is the Red Hand Press Poetry Hour presented by the Broad Stage. I'm Sandra Tsing Loh. Welcome to all of you. Erin Norrie, and if I mispronounce your name, giving you shout outs, Renee Foster, David Sola just saw Natalie last week in Edinburgh, and Bianca and Ron are here, and so many others, Jennifer George, Jared Burton. So next we come to our featured solo performer today, and that is Alanna Mitchell. She's an award-winning Canadian journalist and author who writes about science and social trends, specializing in investigative reporting. Her most recent full-length book, Seasick, The Global Ocean in Crisis, won the Grantham Prize for Excellence in Environmental Journalism and is the basis of her solo show coming up at the Broad Stage in April 2021. Her ebook, Invisible Plastic, What Happens When Your Garbage Ends Up in the Ocean, What Can Go Wrong, was published by the Toronto Star in 2013. She's a regular contributor to the New York Times Science section and to CBC's Quirks and Quarks, in addition to having a regular column in Canadian Wildlife magazine. Welcome, Alanna.
Hi.
All the way from Toronto.
Toronto, yeah. Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure. If I could jump in here, because you have many great things to say. I mean, you talk about growing up with your scientist dad who would regale the family, whether they willed it or not, at the dining room table. But you've said science was just the best story going. Great quote. Can you explicate that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I'm a journalist, and so I'm trained to go for the story that is the most important thing. It's, not the thing that is just peripheral to our lives, but the thing that is really central. And so I spent a lot of my career at the Globe and Mail newspaper in Toronto and in the prairies here in Canada. And as I did all that work, the thing that became clear to me as I spoke with scientists and Indigenous leaders and wisdom gatherers, it was clear to me that what's happening to the planet is the most important story. And so I just had to follow that.
And storytelling, I mean, how you talk about it, science can be thought of as really dry, but the way that you talk about science is really quite mesmerizing. And I think that, I'm remembering of when you were describing like one of your first journeys was to Madagascar. Right? And so can you tell the viewers what it felt like and looked like when you first encountered Madagascar?
So I was flying from the middle of Canada over to Madagascar, so to the other side of Africa. And I think 10 time zones in total. It was my first journey below Europe, and I remember flying into the capital, Antananarivo, and then getting into another little plane and flying to the bottom of the island. And as you fly over, you can see all these rivers running red into the sea. This is the soil running into the ocean, and it just looks like this whole island is bleeding, and I'm not the first person to say that. The other people have made that same comment about it. But the thing is that Madagascar is where there's a tremendous amount of indigenous, plants and animals that live nowhere else, and so it's just the ability to look at that from above and try to take the measure of it, and then later going into these very, very tiny fragments of forests that are left, and trying desperately to find some of the lemurs that are still on the island, which are very, very endangered. It was my first big journey into extinction, into the spasm of extinction that we're in now, and it shaped forever the way I will look at the world.
Yeah, and that was not necessarily what you were expecting to find. And you found out so many fascinating facts about the ocean. I mean, what does it? It contains 99% of the living space on the planet, and
Right.
And then plankton. Like plankton has come up thus far, and plankton is important in your story, isn't it? About what plankton does for us.
Well, I think we already heard from Elizabeth that every second breath of oxygen we breathe comes from plankton. So the thing that really, the thing about science is that it's really about the people who do science. It's about these. That's why I love this theme so much, because it's really about the imaginations of scientists who are able to see things or imagine where we could find out things or what the answers could be. And then they spend these extremely passionate lives, usually very often very, very passionate lives, to try to figure out, the pieces of this puzzle. And that's what's captured me over time, is to engage with these people who are ferociously creative, and yet they're constrained by their discipline into these very, very, very formulaic, usually scientific articles, into this extremely rigid peer review process, which needs to be there. But so I sort of see myself as a translator for them into the public domain, whether I do it in journalism or literary nonfiction or, the play that I wrote as well.
And so creatively, what's that translation process like for you? What are the linguistic tools that you use to translate this great story for the public?
It's all about emotion. For me, it's always about emotion and color. Strangely enough, I mean, when I'm writing a book, I write out. I mean, I have these. I'm in my office right now in Toronto, and so my wall is usually plastered with all these huge pages written in big, almost like crayons, felt pens. These big, thick felt pens that describe the color and smell and taste sometimes of different scenes that I'm trying to describe in the book. And then the arc of the book is always an emotional arc. It has to be an emotional arc, because I think that's what we respond to. That's what we responded to just now in the stories of our poets who we've been listening to. We've been touched on an emotional level. And so I think science communication, science writing, science translation has to have those same elements. It's the language of art.
And before we bring back our panelists, you talk about, I mean, obviously it's dire what's happening with our oceans and coral reefs, so many dead zones, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what the audience should know about the piece that you're doing at the Broad is, yes, like Eric said, it's shocking, it's informative, but it's very entertaining. And it also ends, you have some sense of hope, don't you?
I the thing for me is that I can't stand preaching to people about what's happening. I mean, I love to explain to people what I've discovered, what scientists are discovering. But to me, the idea is not to tell people what they have to do or even tell them what they're doing is wrong. What I crave is for people to understand the meaning of what we're doing and the context for what our species is doing right now. And that's what is endlessly fascinating to me. And it is therefore an incredibly messy journey that we're on. And so I think what the play does is honor that messiness. That's what I think of it as. It's just like we are in, we got a situation here, and it's a really messy situation. And there are a whole bunch of really different, great ways to go about trying to tackle that. And, we're going to give some of them a try. And I think what I have more than the hope is a faith that we are people who have the capacity to do great things, and we're called on now to do that. And I have faith in us.
Well, that's a beautiful idea, and fingers crossed. So now I'd like to bring back our other poets, Elizabeth Bradfield and Natalie Diaz, to have the three of you in conversation around these themes of the poetics of climate change, if you will. one's work as an artist and writer, one's relation to nature, one's relation to the audience, and whatever else has struck you in this program this far.
If I can leap in, I was really struck by something at the beginning that was talked about. It was the whole idea that the goal of art is, or one of the aims of art is to help you change your life, help you change your relationship to things, which I think it's true that I think that we do use art to try to change our relationship to things, but I'm not sure when it comes to climate that it's really on our shoulders alone to do the work as individuals. I mean, I think that part of the thing that really bothers me about that is that we are dealing with massive systems here that need to be changed, and we have agency in that. We have power in that to influence the way these systems work and the way the people who govern those systems work. But I think there's a bit of I get a little frustrated sometimes at the idea that it's all down to whether or not I'm eating enough kale. There are lots of other pieces in play here, and I think it's worth remembering that there are people whose job it is to make the systemic changes, and it's our job to tell them that they have to.
I would agree, and I think that when there's a lot of room in art for rage and for fury and for exploring what too often is unsaid, and at the same time, didactic work that is trying to teach you how to be is going to be boring unless it's born from a genuine personal connection and I think a revelation of one's own flaws, right? I am a flawed human. There are so many ways that I am not living the ideal life that I know is possible in the world. There are so many ways in which I'm flawed. And so I'm interested in exploring those flaws, in humorizing those flaws, and looking at those flaws. And not only the flaws, not only going toward that critique, but also in looking at the moments of genuine connection and hopefully opening for others moments of connection, and moments of connection that aren't often put forward in mainstream media, right? Like if I look at a gray seal, like this morning I was picking up guano-filled cormorant nests and debris, and it was awesome, and it was stinky.
So good.
I was looking out, and there was this beautiful human kind of standing as a support boat, and I was just so in love with that moment. And I suppose I think that art has the opportunity to hold those complexities, and as Natalie so beautifully talked about, I'm gonna say the wrong word, Natalie, so please correct me, but like the erotics of self and land and the non-human world, I think is really important to honor also.
Natalie? No.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you said, like, however you said it was great, I think. I think a lot of, like, for me, what poetry is what it has to be now. I don't know that it began this way because I came to it the way that it was presented to me. And I've since been able to exist as more of myself in it. So if I'm thinking of poetry as an art and, the community of artists I have, like, I think of art as being a practice. So not just a way of like looking, but it's the way I try to live. So I am probably overly intentional or wondrous about language, but I try to remind myself often of the power of language, and climate and weather, I believe, are one language of the earth, and right now we're being told the story of ourselves, our human. There's a very human story that's being told. I don't think this is the only story the Earth is telling. I think in some ways the Earth is also, you know, imagining itself always. I mean, that's kind of the nature, I think, of energy in life, is that, you know, it's capable of reorganizing in ways that the human species is so young. I don't know that we know how to really reorganize. Like, we don't really understand what is the imagination, where does it exist, you know? And so I like thinking, I mean, it lets me, one, like, understand that my human body is one of many bodies, you know, but to think in terms of the ecstatic, like that the Earth is ecstatic, you know, life is a kind of ecstasy. And language is one way I arrive there, but there are other ways that I can, like, you know, lead my body toward some of these, like, relationalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to challenge the taboo against anthropomorphizing, right? To understand or to imagine or to ascribe non-human beings with feelings. There's been such a taboo against that in science, and why? We're not the only feeling things, right? There's mycorrhizal fungi that are sharing resources through forests. There's I've seen whales interact in ways that I can only ascribe as annoyed by other beings in their world, and like thinking that we are the only feeling emotional beings on the planet is ridiculous. You know, it's ridiculous.
And not understanding too that our sensualities have been so narrowed down. You know, we think we have 5 senses. We think we have 7 senses. Like, there are cultures with 30, you know, we count many senses, many sensualities. And I think that feels really, like, one of the reasons why I love your work is being able to see that part and to know that I'm a small part of that, but that's, you know, there are many of those parts. And so I think there's something too about sensuality, and, like, you know, listening to Alanna talk about the oceans is that, you know, sentience is far beyond us and has been here a lot longer than we are. And, you know, it animates us, if anything, you know.
Alanna?
Yeah. Well, you remind me of it's actually the words of a scientist, but who told me that, and this is when I first was able to understand what the ocean really means, but the words were these, that if everything on land were to die tomorrow, everything in the ocean would be fine. But if everything in the ocean were to die tomorrow, everything on land would die too. And I just, you know, this just changed my universe when I first began to understand that. And because we're so terrestrial, you know, it's so hard for us to be in the ocean, really. It's so hard for us. We see it as you know, almost as a 2-dimensional, you know, as a surface practically, when it's really the core, the heart of the biology and the life of the planet and the chemistry. And the fact that we're changing that now is the thing that is to me endlessly fascinating. The fact that our species has been able, with our actions, to make changes to the chemistry of the global ocean, you know, and all of that depth is just a fascinating thing. It's a really unique moment in the history of the planet.
And how do we understand different scales of time, right? There's the idea scientifically of shifting baselines, like what I knew as a kid, that's normal. What my niece and nephew know as kids, that's their normal. What my parents and my grandparents knew, that's their normal. But those are not the same normals. But even those scales are so wrong. I mean, the desert where Natalie lived once was ocean. The land where I live now is ephemeral. Really, it's so short term. And how can we put ourselves in a non-human time scale? And I think that's really the project that we need to engage in. I think a lot of us feel like, oh, that bird is beautiful. And yes, it is. I resonate with that. The flowers in my garden, the tomatoes that I'm harvesting, whatever it happens to be. But to get into a bigger time scale, I think is really essential work right now. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know that I can even do that as a human bound by my body and all the other things binding me. But I think that's the work that we've got to do, especially with plastics in the ocean. Alanna, as you're looking at and talking about too, that they're you know, their infinite lifespan compared to ours.
They're immortal. Yeah, they're immortal. But also to realize that time isn't just linear. I mean, that's the other thing that's so important with all of this, is that to be able to see these time frames up against each other and to see how they all work together, to see that on some level they all are facets of one another. They're all facets of a single dimension, and that to me is, you know, when I'm getting poetic, that's where I go, because to me time is really fascinating that way. But you know, I think time is the missing element to all this entire discussion about extinction and climate. To me, it's the part that we just simply don't comprehend. We even talk about geological time, but it's not. It's even more than that. You know, it's the time of the universe. So,
speaking of time, I wish there was more, because this is really fascinating. Natalie, do you have one quick final thought about the nature of time as we end our panel discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe there is a time. However, I know that I've been, you know, brought within the context of time. And I, you know, like Elizabeth said, that's the difficulty. How do we do that? And probably the most important time that we need to step outside of is that of nation and democracy. You know, we're asking them to do something that is not what they intended. Like, it was actually built against the land as property, water, you know, as resource. And so I think when we're thinking about time, that's a place I don't know how to approach, but I know that that's a pressure point for me.
Thank you very much to our incredible panel, Alanna Mitchell, Elizabeth Bradfield, and Natalie Diaz. Thank you. We have one more poet to round out the evening, and that will be Paisley Rekdal. Currently serving as Poet Laureate of Utah, Paisley Rekdal has written a book of essays, The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee, Observations of Not Fitting In, the memoir Intimate, 5 books of poetry. Her honors include the 2019 Academy of American Poets Poet Laureate Fellowship, a Guggenheim Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Fellowship, a Fulbright, a Civitella Rainieri Residency, an NEA Fellowship, 2019 and 2013 Pushcart Prizes. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, American Poetry Review, the Kenyon Review, the New Republic, Tin House, and Best American Poetry Series, and on NPR. Please welcome Paisley Rekdal, who will take us out with a poem.
Hi. So I was very moved by the conversation about scales and time. And so I'll be reading 2 poems, hopefully. So the first one is called Arctic Scale, and it's after the photos of Subhankar Banerjee. And the one thing that I was really struck by with this work was that as a city person, I had to be sort of re-instructed how to read relationships with the land. The thing that looked violent was actually closer to the land, and the thing that looked beautiful was the thing that was violence to the land. Arctic Scale. The slides grow progressively red. Now the black and yellow slicker encasing the man leans like a ballet dancer across the animal, matching its length and stretch, the strangely stiffened legs and slack head, the man's knife already deep inside the body. He slits fat down to membrane as muscle is exposed to air, the blue cells brightening, gleaming under plastic tendons the man massages, then peels carefully away. There is no face. But children appear in the following frame, and now there is more red, the man and boys taking apart the thickened blood that foams, one enormous jelly pooling the snow so that rubber boots get wetted up to the calf, and what they touch coats them utterly. There is no skin left, only hands becoming intimate with the work, cutting away horns and heart, tongue, lungs, kidney, liver, scooping out intestines filled with grass and placing them to the side, moving into the custard-colored musk nodes hunched at the tail base, then further, looking for whatever is left of use, what beats and swells and stinks and pushes. Now it's white, across which ant-like bodies of pregnant caribou scatter in migration, photos shot from the belly of a Cessna. In the distance, mountain ranges and the unseen sea to which they travel, where the text below it announces oil rigs dip their certain needles, and the Inuit women's breast milk has been declared hazardous waste. It is so beautiful here. Here is a wall-sized field of green with patches of corn silk. Here is a miraculous range seamed with what I have to be told is coal. The enormous glassy sea chattering its blue to the sky, the glacier clasped between them quietly disappearing. Here is a view too big to stand or even read the life inside. The slide clicks to an obscuring shore of gray beside which water churns with miniature balleens in knuckles of white. Changes again. Abstracted fields of snow and ice. And the last, the man has left a flap of caribou skin to dry. It lies in a shrunken patch of snow, small as a child's pink mitten beside him, a valentine. And I'm going to end with one poem called Ballard Locks, which is also a poem about a kind of climate change, what man does to different human or different animal environments. Ballard Locks. Airstruck, wound-gilled, ladder upon ladder of them thrashing through froth, herds of us climb the cement stair to watch this annual plunge back to dying, spawn. So much twisted light the whole tank seethes in a welter of bubbles, more like sequined purses than fish, champagned explosions beneath which the ever-moving smoke fume smacks against glass, churns them up to lake from sea level. The way outside, fishing boats are dropped or raised in pressured chambers, hoses spraying the salt-slicked undersides a cleaner clean. Now the vessels can return to dock. Now the fish in their similar chambers rise and fall along the weirs, smelling the place instinct makes for them. Cities' pollutants sieve through grates, keeping fish where fish will spawn, changing the physics of it, changing ours as well. One giant world encased with plastic rock, seaweed transplanted in thick ribbons for schools to rest in before they work their way up the industrious journey, past shipyard, bus yard, train yard, past bear cave, past ice valley, past the place my father's father once, as a child, stood with crowds and shot at them with guns, then scooped them from the river with a net. Such silvers, pinks, cross-hatched with black. Now there's protective glass behind which gray shapes shift, change, then change again. Can you see the jaws thickening with teeth, scales beginning to plush themselves with blood? Can you see there is so little distinction here between beauty, violence, utility? The water looks like boiling sun. A child has turned his finger into a gun. Bang, the ladders say, as they bring up fish into too bright air, then down again, while the child watches the glass revolves its shapes into a hiss of light. Bang, the boy repeats. His finger points and points. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful work by Paisley Rekdal. And thank you also to our other artists appearing today, Louis J. Rodriguez, Elizabeth Bradfield, and Natalie Diaz. Alanna Mitchell's solo show Seasick comes to the Broad Stage by hook or by crook in April 2021. Visit thebroadstage.org for details. Subscriptions are on sale now. And tune in next month for episode 3 on this, the Red Hen Press Poetry Hour, presented by the Broad Stage. That will be September 24th. Featured solo performer from the Broad will be Tony, and the discussions will be around LGBTQ identities, feminism, performance, and more. So please join us then. And this has been Sandra Tsing Loh with the Red Hen Press Poetry Hour with the Broad Stage. Good night.